Okay, I'm not getting anything when I.
Take the middle seat. We're starting soon. It's still a minute to go. So, feel free to continue your conversations. No problem. I need to be careful because my mic is on. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello to the people watching us online. This event is being broadcast on the World Channel Seed. My name is John Paul Judson. I'm really honored and delighted to be part of the Seed family again here at the World Seed Congress in Cape Town. It's a great honor for me to be moderating the panels this year. Now, today, I don't need to convince this audience of the importance of quality seeds and the value of quality seeds. But even the best quality seed that is obviously going to be packed with great genetics, even that quality seed needs to find a market to express itself, to be grown, to yield crops and food. And in order to meet that market need, it will be conditioned by an agricultural model. And there are lots of different agricultural models around the world. They vary according to different seasons, according to different types of conditions in different regions around the world. But essentially, there are two big differences in agricultural models. The first one is the agricultural model that is by choice, where farmers have a vision and choose a very specific type of agricultural production model. And then there are those agricultural models that are more by design, where farmers are actually developing an agricultural model for subsistence, for themselves, for their families, for rural communities. And these two different agricultural models are obviously extremely different. But each one needs to have access to quality seeds. And how can we enhance farmers' access to quality seed regardless of the agricultural model they're in? And that is the question we will be asking our panelists today. And I would like you to give them a really warm round of applause to our panelists. We are joined by Dr. Julian Jafta. He is Chief Director for Plant Production and Health at the Ministry of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development here in South Africa. Julian, welcome. Shoshan Haran, she is founder and president of Fair Planet. Chris Ojiwo, over on the right, at Seed Systems and Partnerships Lead at CIMIT, one CGIAR. Kulani Machaba, president of the African Seed Trade Association. And Ruremiso Mashumba, she is a farmer from Zimbabwe and CEO of Mnandi Africa. So welcome to all of you. Now, I would like to kick off this session by first understanding the size and the scale of the challenge when it comes to farmers accessing quality seeds. And this panel will focus more specifically on the African continent. And Kulani, as president of the African Seed Trade Association, I'd like you to kick us off and give us a bit of a sense of what are these challenges for farmers to access quality seeds.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. So the challenge of accessing quality seeds for farmers in Africa is quite serious. From an African Seed Trade Association, our analysis has shown that today, less than 30% of the farmers across the African continent have access to improved seed varieties. So most are still planting farm-safe seed, open pollinated varieties, and seeds that are not of high quality. One of the major challenges that we have identified as causing this challenge is because of lack of investment by the private sector as well as the public sector in improved yields varieties. Why is that happening? It's because in many countries there's no formalized seed systems, or if they are there, they are not functioning properly, which means the regulatory framework needs to be improved. So I'll conclude by saying this. If an investor, whether it's from the public sector or from the private sector, doesn't know that when they invest, they will be able to recoup their return on investment by getting intellectual property protection for a period of time, or by making sure that when that seed gets into the market, it will be properly deployed, there will not be infringement of IP by fake seeds, they won't go into the market. And that is the major challenge that we're facing today. To wrap it up, I want to give an example of cereal yields in Africa today. A farmer across the African continent, typical farmer today, achieves cereal yields of less than 2 tons per hectare. Most of the farmers get 1.5 tons per hectare. In Asia and other developed economies, that I could say, comparatively speaking, have a lot of smallholder farmers. They are getting 4 to 5 tons per hectare. And in first world countries, the yields are much higher than 10 tons per hectare. So it's the African continent, which is the biggest continent in the world, that is fallen behind. We missed the green revolution. And hopefully, as we move forward, we can be able to catch up. And that is the role of AFSTA, to make sure that we bring all stakeholders together in the private sector, public sector, also the seed trade, to solve this challenge so that we can solve the problems of food security. Thank you.
So you mentioned a challenge for investment and this investment framework that is not working in Africa. In South Africa, Julian, can you give us a sense of what are the main challenges for farmers to access quality seed?
Thank you for the question, and I'll link slightly onto what Kulani has said. I think in the opening proceedings this morning, you've heard from a young farmer, and it gives you a sense that in South Africa we have a very commercial sector, and then we have the informal sector. And the informal, I think I would want to believe that the commercial sector has no real challenges in accessing quality seed. They are the main actors, and there's good collaboration between government and the regulatory authorities as well as the commercial sector. However, when it comes to the smallholder or the subsistence sector, there's quite a bit of challenges there. They are often dependent on government support programs where inputs are made available. And although from our point of view, we often try to advise what that input ought to be, there is really a challenge often as to what seed is ultimately made available to that particular farmer. When it comes to the investment that Kulani is speaking, we are privileged to have a strong public sector breeding program associated with the Agricultural Research Council. However, we can identify with the challenge around the investment that goes into breeding, and that is also a challenge for our Agricultural Research Council, because remember, you can't just have a once-off investment. Breeding programs do take time. And then I think what often also happens is because of a lack of investment, that some of these research institutions, whether it's state-owned or universities, they do then become entangled in protection of their varieties, which then leads them to enter into licensing agreements, which also then complicates access to the improved varieties. You would have heard that our DM also spoke about that publicly funded research and IP resulting from that ought to make it easy for public access to those protected varieties, but there obviously are also challenges in that regard. And then we're speaking about the new developments, this new seed technologies. I think there's also challenges that comes along with the regulatory frameworks that are attached to these new technologies. There are user burdens, if I could call it that, that comes along. There's obligations that are assigned to users of these new technologies, which it's perhaps one of those unintentional consequences which is as a result of just the regulatory framework. So those are the ones that I would like to cover for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julian. So, Ruamiso, you're a farmer in Zimbabwe. Do you also see this big distinction between the government support programs for applying to certain farmers and then the commercial sector? And does that make a big difference when it comes to access to quality seed for farmers?
Absolutely, it does. Something that I've seen is that we seem to take serious commercial farming, and we don't really take serious communal farming or the smallholder farmers. The smallholder farmers are the ones that usually get experimental or seed that isn't the best quality. When I say best quality, I mean even for the soil, for the climate. So you find, I remember I once grew as a sample of some seed that we were distributing in our community, and the yield potential of that seed was so low. Yet these smallholder farmers are the poorest and struggling to actually feed themselves and to sell. So continuously we're getting poverty year in, year out. I remember in Zimbabwe, I was sitting in a horticulture meeting and we were struggling with access to onion. We were not able to have a good variety or cultivar that we could plant that had a long shelf life. All the varieties we were planting had a very short shelf life, and we now had a huge shortage of onion. And you find that there will be sometimes like legislation that's stopping importation of very important seed. So access to seed is very important for us to be able to feed ourselves, to be able to produce enough food for people to eat with the correct nutrition that they require. So I find because I work in the rural areas and I'm working with smallholder farmers, that access to seed is still a topic, a very heated topic today. Yet we have been farming for many, many years and we still do not have access to quality seed.
So here you're talking about a level of injustice where those in most need of good quality seeds are not able to access it. But would you say that that's a problem of the way the government support programs are built, or it's a problem in the way that the commercial sector is not able to reach those farmers?
I think it's a combination of, we need to see, because we're continuously talking about we're going to have 1 billion people living in Africa in 2050. We are talking about the need to produce. Right now, the resources we have are not going to increase in terms of land, water. Maybe they actually would decrease in terms of fertility of soils, in terms of access to water. But we're not serious in terms of our agendas to ensure that what the measures we are doing will help those farmers to produce. Because if we continuously see the poor farmer with the hand hoe, with the ox drawn, farming in these primitive methods, using recycled seed, giving them the whatever crumbs just to say at least we gave them, and taking pictures to say we supported the community. What we really need to do is audit, what have we done for our people? Is it benefiting them, or is it keeping them even more poor? So I think there's a lot in that, but what is important is for us to realize that the ones that do not have access are usually the poorest. And why is there that barrier?
Okay, thanks for that. Chris, I'd like to bring you in on this one. So we've heard a few points already being raised on the government support programs, on the investment frameworks. What is your view on some of the main challenges that farmers are facing here in Africa to access quality seeds?
Thank you. I come from an international research institution, so much of my approach will be from a research-based approach. And I want to start by saying, first of all, I'm looking at the public sector variety development aspects and saying First of all, the challenges with regard to the varieties that have been released, part of which are on the shelf, and the challenge could be because they are not sufficiently differentiated in terms of market segments, an issue that the public sector is currently relooking at in terms of market segmentation and better targeting for the farmers to be able to get the right access, not just to quality seed, but quality seed of the right varieties also of their interest. And the second thing I would like to allude to or to refer to is basically with regard to data. I know most of our research institutions talk so much about data, but at a level that is not necessarily relevant to the various stakeholders to understand and to make commercialization decisions. We're talking about data in terms of just equations from breeders equations and increase in yield, but not looking at all the value proposition about a particular variety that will enable the farmer to make a decision to say, yes, I've been producing my variety and keeping my seed, but I see a value in taking up a new variety. I see a value in replacing my farm-saved seed approach to getting seed from somewhere else. Do you have that displayed in a way that a farmer would understand from a scientist level to a farmer's level? Can we climb down to the level of the farmers and, of course, enable the farmer to be able to make such kind of commercialization decisions? And the third point I'd like to emphasize on is the capacities, particularly of the public sector, to be able to avail early generation seed, and perhaps also link up with the private sector in terms of certified seed production. And some of the varieties developed publicly face the challenge of early generation seed supply, that even if the private sector are looking for the early generation seed, they're not able to supply the certified seed because of the lack of early generation seed, the breeder seed and the foundation seed. And the next point I'd like to put emphasis on is on limited involvement actually in the private sector. We understand that the private sector has the massive capacity for scaling that the public sector and the other informal sector approaches don't have. But the private sector is not absolutely involved in all the publicly bred crops and publicly bred varieties. And so that leaves a gap because then these varieties do not benefit from the massive capacity and power and I would say comparative advantage of the private sector to be able to do a proper scaling that would happen with the other crop varieties and crop types. And my points are not exhaustive. I'll still be able to connect between the demand and supply nexus, which I think there is quite a bit of a gap. And this I can give typical examples where the public sector produces seed this year, and that seed is not demanded by anyone. So they think next year, why are we producing seed that is not demanded? So next year they don't produce seed, and suddenly you have institutional buyers from the government, from international organizations saying we're looking for 10,000 tons of a particular crop, of a particular variety. And so the public sector goes ahead and produces the seed and say, okay, we see demand. Now the next year, you've produced the 10,000 tons and nobody's demanding it anymore. It was just for emergency of last year and it's not. So that inconsistency between demand and supply is quite a challenge in terms of sustainability of access to seed. Otherwise, we would want to have some sort of level of consistency between supply and demand, and that sort of demand analysis in terms of what is the current demand, what is the trend, what is the foresight, where are we heading in terms of demand, so that we have a proper seed production planning that then meets that demand and that responds to that sort of demand signal, which currently I don't think we have sufficient database that we be able to correspond between seed supply planning and demand analysis, demand data that will be able to respond to that. And I'm sure that is something that would be of interest to the public, to the private sector, if you would be able to supply, avail demand data and say, this is the current demand, this is what the trend looks like, this is what the future looks like. If the CGIAR and other international research institutions can be able to supply such kind of information. And close to last is on the issue of awareness of varieties, particularly publicly developed varieties. Who creates awareness? Who invests in that awareness? Does the government invest in awareness creation, in demand creation, as much as perhaps privately developed varieties where we know, well, this is my variety, let me promote it. How much in terms of investment do we get into demand creation, awareness creation, promotion of varieties that have been released so that the farmers have a knowledge of the varieties that they're talking about? And I know you're looking at your time, so let me limit to second last point and say that one of the other challenges basically besides, this awareness creation is, the language we have in computer, you talk of garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't invest in proper seed quality, you're not likely to get proper grain quality either. And it is grain quality, seed demand is basically derived demand. It's derived from grain demand. And grain demand here is from grain traders, from processors, and from all these other, post-farm operation actors. Now, if we are not able to invest sufficiently in good quality, then it becomes a vicious cycle because the grain quality is poor, the seed quality will continue to be poor because nobody is supplying the right quality for the right grain. And policy becomes an important issue here, adequate policies that support this, and the list goes on and on.
We'll go into some of the solutions in a second, Chris, so we'll pick up on that. But you mentioned this challenge of raising awareness and educating farmers on the value of quality seed, and then addressing this market failure, which you explained very clearly. Shoshan, we've heard a lot of different challenges here on the panel. Can you first reflect on those and confirm or otherwise based on your experience?
Yeah, so the challenges are enormous, and by the way, I'm also a farmer. And 2 women farmers on the panel. This is nice, I think. So I worked for the private sector for many years for a seed company. And I think all of us here, farmers and the private sector and the public sector, know that seeds are the basis for the food supply in the world. But as we heard from the other panelists, they are not accessible to smallholder farmers in developing countries. And indeed, it is a market failure that needs to be addressed. And that's why I founded Fair Planet 11 years ago, to bridge the gap between the best seeds in the world and the poorest farmers. And the reason I thought it's something that needs to be done is because if we just build on market demands, it will be too slow and the problem will not be solved. So the idea is we are an NGO, Fair Planet, and we are willing to invest a lot of effort in smallholder farmers, not only testing which varieties are best suited for their local farming practices and agricultural conditions, but also invest in capacity building. So what we do, we have a very wide alliances with the private sector. 9 of the seed companies are working with us, and we are about to start a big project by ISF in Rwanda to link the private sector with the public sector, with a local organization, and to build seed resilience. So a little bit from our experience, what I can tell you very simply is when we do identify the best suitable varieties for local needs, and we train the farmers in the local extension system how to get the best out of these seeds, they are becoming self-sustained. They are buying the seeds for the next season. It creates a market for the private sector. We have 11 years of experience in Ethiopia and some years of experience in Tanzania. And once the farmers start to use high quality seeds and increase their profits, then they are becoming customers of the seed companies. And it's a business to business relation. Although they are smallholders, but they are very smart people. And once they see the benefits, the economic benefits, and also, of course, food security, nutrition security, then they are starting to buy the seeds. And the spread of technology is very quick, because what we found out in Ethiopia, that on average, the farmers are tripling their productivity once they use high quality seeds, but also good agricultural practices. And just to say that capacity building is the main effort that we invest. So if I look at our programs altogether, 20% of our efforts go to the technical phase, which is variety trials and analyzing the benefits of different varieties coming from the different seed companies. But then capacity building of the local extension system and capacity building of the farmers are 80% of our efforts and resources.
So to build on that then, we're talking about addressing a market failure. So who is responsible for addressing that market failure, and how do we implement it in such a way that it's a sustainable response? Because philanthropy can do so much, but it also then needs to be taken up over time by farmers on the ground. Julian, maybe first in a South African setting, how have you addressed this problem?
Around the market failure? Yes, I think the market failure is as a result of breeding happening, but without giving due consideration of the local context. Because unfortunately, multinational seed companies have a particular interest, and they don't necessarily release or develop those what we could consider orphan crops, which have a local relevance. So I think there is the opportunity really for us to invest more in terms of the public sector breeding. There is also an opportunity for collaboration between the breeding companies and public sector institutions, especially in terms of sharing the appropriate technologies. And we've had experiences, as was mentioned a number of times this morning during the opening session, where there was expression of seed companies working with farmers, and those are good. And we would wish for those to continue, because seed companies obviously have all the combined resources to do that. But I think there's also quite a bit of work that we still need to do to ensure that we are developing some varieties that are not the mainstream varieties, and that is where cross-fertilization and use of technologies could definitely assist. Thank you.
Okay, and Kulani, because you mentioned this challenge of a framework that is not investment friendly for the private seed sector. How do you go around this? How do you try and adapt seeds to local situations? Do you think there is a business response to this market failure that would be possible?
Most definitely, yes. I think, as I said, we're not making great strides, but small steps of improvements are being made. At the high level, we have seen that the African Union has become very active in the agricultural space now, coming with different model regulatory frameworks that the countries are able to adopt and customize to fit their local situations. Because there is an element of trust. If the private sector proposes a certain regulatory framework to the authorities, sometimes the private sector is viewed as having vested interests, and therefore that is not always well received. And that slows down the deployment of innovative agricultural technologies that result in high yields, and the farmers get access to these technologies very late, long after their world has moved on. So, for example, the issue of agricultural biotechnology, we're only having about 6 African countries that are using biotech traits. But we can see the results in South Africa, for example. Since the introduction of biotech traits, when they were commercialized to date, there's been 22% yield increase across the board for cereal crops. So there is innovation does make a difference. And the next wave is plant breeding innovation. Once again, from an African perspective, we're moving slowly to adopt these innovative technologies. And I'm scared that we may make the same mistake as with the Green Revolution, that by the time we see that the technology is beneficial for our farmers, the train would have moved on. So that's very important. But as I said, going back to the African Union, now to the regional economic communities, the ECOWAS, the SADC harmonization system of regulatory frameworks, it's helping a lot. But we also need to move from the bottom up with our farmers, with the seed trade industry, as well as with our local governments, to make sure that we meet each other halfway for everyone to benefit.
Okay, brilliant. And Ruramiso, I mean, we've heard that there is a very strong role to be played by the public breeding programs here in Africa. How do you see the combination of that with the private seed sector breeding programs to the benefit of farmers? And do you think this cooperation could help to address market failure?
Absolutely. I always say that the challenges in agriculture are not that many. We talk about them year in, year out. But the greatest challenge we have is that we seem to work in different groups. So you find that there's certain challenges we have, access to knowledge, but there's people working on that, access to seed, access to fertilizer, access to the markets. We really need to see agriculture as an important sector where all these arms are of vital importance. So until the private sector starts talking to farmers, can we begin to make progress? I have never had the seed company come and ask me after I've grown their seed if that seed gave me the best result. Yes, I am the one who is planting their seed in the environment with all the challenges. I'm not seeing development of seed farmer coming from the farmer going to research. So I think there's so much division. You find people in research, in academic, are very far removed from the challenges that are faced by farmers. Farmers were bearing the cost. We still buy the seed at the market value, and we plant, and if the seed was not ideal, because there's climate change. Maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that variety was ideal, but it's no longer ideal. Still planting that seed, and then I get 1 ton, and I still have to go to market, and I'm the one who has to bear that cost. So I think until private sector takes it seriously, that these farmers, as much as they are our customers, but they're also the people for tomorrow who need to still be alive, because at the rate we're going, there's going to become a time when a certain population will be wiped out by hunger or malnutrition, because we didn't act today. Thank you.
That's a very serious call to action, Ruamiso. Chris, you were beginning to touch upon some of the solutions and projects that you have in mind we're making everything fall, that you have in mind to try and address this market failure. Can you just expand then a little bit on the Seed Equal initiative in particular that you're working on?
Thank you very much. Maybe picking from where Ruramiso's left in terms of feedback to the public sector, and of course definitely to the private sector, because that was our response, and to say that the international agricultural research institutions have relooked into the kind of work they're doing, and in the process of reorganizing how we work, first by developing a market segment for the varieties that will be developed and released. And the market segmentation process here is basically looking at where the variety will be produced, who will produce that variety, how the variety will be produced, then all together combining to form what we're calling a product profile, which is basically what will be produced. And then making use of what we're calling genetic resources within the CGIR, and to these genetic resources working into accelerated breeding to develop new varieties. So we don't just go through the old process of developing varieties for the sake of developing varieties, but looking at varieties being developed with the markets in mind, which was never for a long time our intentions. And then jointly, we from the side of Seed Equal now work towards delivery. Our role is basically to partner with public and private sector towards delivery of these varieties. And of course, I'd want to mention that the Seed Equal initiative works across several, I would say, work packages. We have 6 work packages in general, but for the first 3 of them are very crop-specific work packages. Work package 1, looking at cereals, for which I'm sure several institutions, public and private, involved here have worked with maize, have worked with rice and similar cereals. And then we have work package on legumes, this is the second work package. And the third one perhaps is more of a public sector approach and perhaps less of a private sector, some private sector involved in vegetatively propagated crops too, through tissue culture and other approaches. But then, of course, the other work packages, which I'm sure are of interest to the public sector as well as the private sector, is a work package on partnerships and particularly capacity building. And capacity building here in terms of building the capacities of farmers, building the capacities of national institutions and the private sector to be able to produce early generation seed, which are talked about as a challenge, and to really provide that as a solution rather than leaving it as a challenge. And then looking at policies, and policies here basically, I know that we are not policy makers per se, but our interest in policy is basically developing robust data and evidence base for policy making. So the policies that are developed by policymakers are actually making the policies that are backed by data. Looking at the consequences of the policies that are made. You don't just make policies for the sake of policies, but looking at the sustainability, the potential consequences. For example, if you decide that you're going to look at subsidies as an example, is it sustainable? Is there a good reason for you to use subsidies as an approach? So looking at some of these and backing them up with data. And the last aspect of it, which is, again, I would imagine several people are interested in here, is basically equitable access to seed. And equitable here involves also farmers who are less rich, the women farmers specifically, for example, and some farmers in remote areas and disadvantaged farmers. How do we ensure that we are intentional in terms of getting access to seed to them? Otherwise, it would not just be business as usual as seed is in the market, whoever can access it, go ahead and access it. That is not intentional. We have to be deliberate, we have to be intentional in terms of getting farmers, and specifically women farmers, youth farmers, to access seed.
Thanks, Chris. And Shoshan, in your project, you were explaining that you're trying to demonstrate the value of new varieties by trialing them with farmers, and then they end up buying those varieties thereafter. But there must still be some market failure that you need to address in order to empower farmers to buy these varieties. And I would imagine also it might not always be easy to attract the private seed sector into this kind of project. Could you also maybe reflect on that side of the capacity building as well?
Yeah, so when we train lead farmers in these villages, we give them a sample of seeds or seedlings, depends on the crop, because this is the industry standard. You know, I'm a farmer in a kibbutz in Israel, and when seed companies develop new varieties, they give sample of seeds, and if the farmer is happy with the performance, then next year they buy. And we think this is the approach that should be the same with smallholder farmers in Africa and elsewhere. So to kickstart with smallholders, we give them a sample of seeds provided by our seed partners, of course. We do not develop seeds. We give them a seed sample for 1,000 square meter and training on the farm. And with this, I want to address the point you raised, because we have a very unique training methodology that we train lead farmers on their own farmlands, and therefore we have constant feedback from the farmer on the performance of the variety. So we don't lose contact with the farmers. And also the extension system, the local extension system, is working shoulder to shoulder with us and continue doing this after we leave the region. Regarding the private sector, so up until now it was our individual, let's say, network approaching the seed companies on 2 levels. First, doing good. You're developing the basis for food production in the world, for business by farmers. So doing good is part of what you are doing. And then developing your future markets. And we have an excellent example in Ethiopia. So part of our program was supported by the Dutch government. And the increase in the value of imported vegetable seeds into Ethiopia in 5 years was by $8 million on an annual basis. So that, and also the private, the SMEs, the small businesses in Ethiopia, started to produce seedlings from high quality seeds, and their businesses increased by 20% within 5 years. So you have a shared benefit. The farmers is producing much more food, increasing their profits by about, on average, $500 from 1,000 square meters. Local SMEs are increasing their business, and the private sector is increasing the business. So it's a win-win-win situation. And just to stress the point, we are an NGO, non-profit, and we see ourselves as facilitators, bridging the market failure, but then we want to live, because the idea is both sides will make profit and work directly with each other like any farmer in the developed world. And now we are very happy to say that we started with ISF a new project in Rwanda, and we were fortunate that Bayer corporate giving enabled us to get the kickstart for the first year. So we are already on the ground in Rwanda. It's an ISF flagship project, and we call upon the private seed companies to join this project, and also the public sector, because this is with the Seed Association of Rwanda, with AFSTA hopefully will join the effort. Farmers' organizations will be part of this project, and of course the Rwanda Ministry of Government already signed an MOU with us for the project. So this is the right place, I think, to call all of the stakeholders in the room to join this project.
Okay, that's the second call to action already. Maybe actually that's a good time to see, are there any initial reactions or questions in the audience to what we've heard on some of the challenges outlined and the solutions raised? So I see, do we have a, okay, maybe I'll use this one. That's fine, I'll move around, no problem. Yeah, we have one question here.
Thank you so much.
Please introduce yourself briefly.
Oh, my name is Olalekan Kimbo. I work for African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. We are based in Midrand. I just want to thank the organizer for inviting us. I want to follow up on what the president of AFSTA just mentioned, which is very critical for this audience to know, that things are changing and there's progress. And it is time for the seed company to take opportunity that is being presented to them through African Union. And he made mention of harmonization of policy. And for our role as the development agency for the Union, the head of state are giving us the mandate that the Agenda 2063 should be implemented, the Africa we want. And one of the pillars of the Africa we want is zero hunger. And for zero hunger to be implemented, we need innovation. And through the President Kagame's reformation of NEPAD, they gave the mandate in creation of centers of excellence in science, technology, and innovation to drive innovation. And there are policy that is made in place for this to be achievable. But this cannot be done without the industry. And the free trade zone that have been created that will allow for trading to be efficient, effective on the continent is also another opportunity for the seed industry to take opportunity of knowing fully that Africa is an agrarian continent and the potentials are there. And when we always say enough of policy that does not speak to science, because until policy translates to science, then there's no benefit to the farmer. And the farmer is the end user of any innovation. And until we drive innovation, that in the state that we are now, there is no translation. And when we are talking of translation, we are talking of profitability. And any innovation that cannot be scaled up cannot be commercialized. And so the component of commercialization of innovation that is coming into the continent using the harmonization that is being put in place in the continent through the African Union is where the opportunity has presented itself to the industry. So I think after I've said what is important, and we also look into that so that we can take opportunity of the innovation that is coming to the continent. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. That seems to be part of the answer to the market failure. We have a few raised hands. Try and keep it short and sharp if possible.
Okay, my name is Mpopit Petla from the University of Limpopo. Well, all the speakers, they speak of the importance of seeds. But then when you look into research, you find that farmers are exposed to us as the students, and they speak of biodiversity. And one thing I know that when farmers get seeds, they are simultaneously they'll do monocropping. And it's one of the factors that constitute to negative impacts that were observed with the Green Revolution. Even though that the train has left us, but then we might fall victim to those negativities. So what are you doing as seed companies to ensure that we don't fall victim to those negative impacts that Green Revolution left in India and also in Mexico? Thank you.
Could we have a reaction from Kulani? Yeah?
So thank you very much. So I believe that almost all seed companies now, they are no longer just going to the market to, let me use a strong word, dump seed and go away. So every time the seed goes to the farmers, we try and liaise with farmer association to have farmer information days, training on good agronomic practices, the benefits of the different types of seeds, what characteristics made seeds to be suitable for particular land areas and not others. So there's outreach programs that we are implementing, some as individual companies, and some we do it in partnership with government authorities and also as seed associations. So there has been that acknowledgement, as was highlighted earlier on, that also the industry in the past has not been doing much in this area, but we have identified the weaknesses. We got the feedback also from smallholder farmers that they need more information. So we have outreach efforts, and I can confidently say that as far as I know, with AFSTA members, at least 70% of them, when they are doing their marketing programs, there is a philanthropic element to make sure that we assist the smallholder farmers, not for profit-making purposes, but just for pure development purposes. And that's what we're doing to close the gap. It's something that we really encourage.
Okay, thank you. And Chris, you also want to jump in?
Just a quick addition to that is that from the CGR perspectives, I mentioned so much about the genetic innovation, but I would like to mention that there are other action areas, and one of them is on resilient agri-food systems, which actually looks at cropping systems and agri-food systems, not as individual crops and monocrop as you mentioned. And so I would like to say in just a sentence that we still need the Green Revolution, but redefined not as monocrops, but as systems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a question over here.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ruzani Sadiki. I'm a farmer from Limpopo in Tavazimbi. My question directed to the panel members. I interacted with some farmers from overseas whom they were talking about producing yield for 6-10 tons per hectare on sunflower. I need to know how many plants, how many seeds per hectare they're producing, or is it because of their good climate or what? Because we don't go to that level. Thank you.
Okay, and this also touches upon the more educational aspect around around the agricultural model, agricultural production. I don't know who wants to take that one up. Yeah, Shoshan? Okay, please.
So I cannot be specific to your question of how many seeds per hectare and so on, but a great part of the effort that we are doing at Fair Planet is testing exactly what you're asking. So for each crop, we are testing what is the best way to produce using local farming practices. So with minimal changes or gradual changes in the way that the smallholder farmer is producing the crop, but we are teaching about the spacing and about how to improve fertilization, what is the optimization of irrigation and so forth. And we develop crop production protocols for each crop using locally available materials and traditional practices. So I cannot answer specifically to the crop that you addressed, but this is part of our mission to bridge not only the seed gap, but the knowledge gap. And we have a wealth of training materials, each specific for a region, for a season, and for a crop.
Okay, thank you. A question over here.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Chikombodoro Chovu. I'm part of the iFarmer Young Board. I just first want to say thank you so much. That was quite an enriching panel, especially on informing the differences that smallholder and subsistence farmers face vis-a-vis your commercial farmers. My question's in line with research. In addition to more of your scientific data-driven on the performance of the seed, how much will social and economic research on communities influence how governments roll out their initiatives? Because I think oftentimes we're looking at how much to produce, but not necessarily how it impacts the community socially and economically. Thank you.
Okay, that's a challenging question. I would like to, who could answer that one? Chris, definitely partly. I think Julian as well. It would be quite, maybe actually Julian first.
It's definitely not an easy one, but more and more, I think there is a realization that you can't just enter a community without understanding what is happening in a community, and this is why I think in the government structure now is, if you look at agriculture, that is now combined with land reform and rural development, so that you're not just focusing on agriculture, but you have a much broader perspective of what is happening within the socioeconomic space and that element of the clientele that we are looking at. So from government perspective, we just in terms of how we are organized, there's already an indication that there is that consideration. Thank you.
Okay. Chris as well?
Yeah, I think I'll answer the previous question and then add to hers first by saying that what you see as an outcome of the variety performance is an issue of the genetics of the variety, the management, and the environment. So just G by E by M in brief. And for years around the socioeconomic issues, I do say it is important to look at the impact, the socioeconomic impact for sure. And at the CGR, I would say there are 5 integrated areas that look at all these socioeconomic impacts, looking at nutrition, health, food security, poverty reduction, livelihoods, jobs, gender equality, youth, social inclusion, climate adaptation and mitigation, environmental health, and biodiversity, all working together in different work areas, or let me say impact areas. And it is not right, as I say, I may agree with you, to assume that every socio-economic impact will be positive. Sometimes there are positives and sometimes there are negatives, and I could give examples of negatives where when people get more money, and fortunately these are data reported, men have more money, they marry more wives, they drink more alcohol, they live families in tatters. It's reported. It's good impact that there's more money, But the further impact on that is perhaps negative in terms of family. So looking at the overall socioeconomic impact is indeed critical, and I do agree with your support.
Okay,
Can
we have a last.
I would like to add to that.
Okay, very quickly.
Yes, that the best thing is to research by an external institute what are the impact, and to learn and to adapt. So just to say, at least from our experience in Ethiopia, nutrition has improved dramatically, also the number of kids going to school, and also the ability of farmers to save money and to reinvest in farming. So doing more money, I think we can all agree, is good. What you do with the money, at least me, I trust the farmers that they know what they need to do. We don't need to patronize anybody, and they are smart. We give them the opportunity, and they use it for the best, at least from our experience in Ethiopia, based on the research.
Okay, a final question from the audience.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. François Burgot, honorary life member of African Sea Trade Association. Just to show that in this panel we have the best part of Africa. People who are working in southern part, except Fair Planet, which is in Ethiopia, but the situation is worse than what you describe in West and Central Africa. And two remarks. First, in West and Central Africa, and especially West, we can't talk about smallholder farmers. We have to talk about no-holder farmers. Because the land is not, the farmers have no ownership on their land. So it's very difficult for them to invest. Secondly, when you say, Jean-Paul, we need to improve regulation, we have to be clear. We need to have less regulation. And improving is less regulation, harmonized regulation. And we have still big problem on that. And even today, governments in West African countries, Central African countries, they have a lot of imagination about new regulation of seeds. And at the end of the day, what is the situation? 20 years ago, in ECOWAS, 7% only of the seeds used in ECOWAS were from ECOWAS. 20 years after, with harmonized regulation, is 4%. So we decrease the part of ECOWAS seed in ECOWAS in 20 years. And finally, it's clear, it's not a problem of the private sector. The private sector is ready to address the needs of farmers. It's really a problem of policies. And it's really the responsibility of the governments to have policy which allow private seed companies to be there and to address farmers' needs.
Okay, thank you very much. And in fact, that's what I would like to finish the panel on. And we'll have a very last round before I'll invite our colleague to make the conclusions of this panel. It's on this policy response, and just to bounce off on what Francois just mentioned, I mean, we've heard a lot of the challenges that we face here in Africa, which is actually also that agriculture is not in a vacuum. It's also part of a broader development. And what place does agriculture have as primary production in a society? All of this will influence a lot the type of farming that we have in a country. So there's already a lot of challenges. So if I may ask you this question, and I'll ask all of you to answer very shortly. Should public authorities invest in breeding, in public breeding, or should they rather use that investment in the broader frameworks that allow, farmers to grow? Okay, that's a bit of a challenging one, but if you had to choose, which path do you think you should go for? Okay, can I start with Chris?
Oh, why are people laughing? Yeah, I mean, I would like to put on a different hat here as a co-chair of African Seed and Biotechnology Partnership Platform Steering Committee and mentioned that we have a very strong interaction, again, from research from the African Union side to have policies that are backed by data. As I mentioned before, that it's not enough to just develop policies, but it's good to have data-driven policies, evidence-based policies. And of course, there's a delicate balance between what you're considering in the strict sense of farmer seed and varieties developed by the research institutions, both public and private. Yes, where's the balance here? The balance here is if we keep what we consider in the strict sense of the farmer seed, are we able to get what the gentleman was asking about, the genetic gains in the farmer's field, where the farmer could be producing 2 kilograms or 2 tons per hectare, yet another farmer somewhere is able to get 10 tons per hectare. Are we comfortable with the 2 tons per hectare, or do we want to improve beyond the 2 tons per hectare to something else? And if you want to improve beyond 2 tons per hectare and invest in that, what investment do you want to make to move from 2 tons per hectare to 10 tons per hectare? Is it sufficient to the farmer's seed, or do you want to involve a crop improvement? And if you ask me, as you said, you asked me to make a comment from a policy perspective, for sure, we need to invest in improving the varieties and make varieties that take advantage of the 3 elements I talked about. One is the genetic potential that then is unlocked by the environment and the management.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Julian. You need to make a choice.
I'm obviously from public sector, so I would. It's a difficult one because from our conversation, I think we've been very clear that there are different roles for government as well as private sector to fulfill. Government also has the responsibility towards their citizens, and I think, and I'm not saying that the private sector would not have the best interests of the citizens at heart, but there's just, I believe that governments should continue to invest, but that it's, and I've heard this word this morning, there's a co-creation issue at play here. And therefore, I cannot see it that government would not invest or decide to just focus in one area. There's a policy response from government required, I believe, but then also government's public sector institutions and entities should be clearly involved within research towards developing new varieties, and also in other areas where we need to develop the information base which would inform further policy development. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. We're going to have to get even shorter now on the answer, because we're just above. So, Kulani, 30 seconds.
Yes. If we look at what happened in the past, the markets were highly regulated, and the public sector organization and national research, agricultural research organizations had the best breeders and were developing a lot of varieties, which we're still using today, especially for what are called orphan crops, but also including parental inbred lines for maize. If you go to Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, we are still using those varieties. But the market has changed. They are not getting enough funding from the government. They have lost a lot of breeders, so the model has to change. They are not able to keep up with the latest techniques, latest developments, and therefore the main role now of national agricultural research organizations is to partner with the industry and government to improve overall productivity. They can no longer do it alone. So in a nutshell, that's my thinking, and the policy interventions, because there are scientists in those organizations that are trusted by the government, they should be in the forefront of policy advocacy work to create a conducive environment for agricultural investment.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Ramiso.
Okay, so looking at experience as a farmer, I would say that government is very inefficient, even our research, all our research stations that are run by government. So I would say that government needs to regulate and private sector should develop. Agriculture should be seen as a business and treated as a business, but at the same time, we need to make sure that the access for each farmer is equal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Shoshan, a final word.
Well, you saved me sometimes, so I would say bridging the gap. Wherever you have a good solution developed by the private sector, the government should, and the public sector should help farmer access this solution. For orphan crops, then it's orphan, so it's the government or the public sector responsibility. But I would stress the point, capacity building. This is something that the public sector should take on and really bridge the knowledge gap, improve the farming practices, and improve the access to whatever the private sector already developed and is elsewhere available, make it available to your farmers too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. A warm round of applause for our 5 panelists. It was a very engaging conversation, so thank you very much. And I'd like to hand over the final word to Lorena Basso. She is chair of the ISF Task Force on Empowering Farmers Through the Diversity of the Seed Sector. Lorena, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to join this panel, this brilliant panel. I would like to tell you that I'm co-chairing this task force with Marianne Sayon, my friend, so I would like to say thank you to her. So this is the time that I would like to share with you the next steps of our task force. But first, I would like to thank you, to all of you, to be here, for your thoughts, for your ideas, and for your commitment with the subject. So thank you a lot. Now the next step, I don't know if we have a, yes, you can see in the screen, because now we are talking about a new narrative that is changing, because we came from a political debate on a false opposition between the farmer right and the breeder right, and going to the new view that is concretely when we think about the actions that the seed companies or the seed sectors are doing every day with the farmers, and that is what we do every time. So that is important. For this year, we have a very interesting agenda. 5 points you can see there. First is the Fair Planet. It's a ISF initiative, and Soshan has been shared with you a lot of things about that. If you have time, please read more about that and keep it in mind, because it's a very interesting program, very interesting initiative that keep in mind. Second is the Seed Food Coalition. We are talking about food. We are talking about production system. That is important. It's a private and a public initiative too. And then 3 things that we have to follow what is going on in other areas. First is a research from FAO that we are follow. What are they talking about? They are talking about what the regulation, what the law could affect the access of the farmers access of that seed for the farmers. That is important to follow, and we are doing that from our task force. Another thing, we are in the preparation of a symposium about the farmers' rights that will be in September in India. The World Farmers Organization is involved too. That is very important to follow it. For the end, we have been involved in UPOP with a group that is always thinks and working on the small farmers. So the next the next meeting, I think that is in October this year, so we are very involved in that group too. So that are our next steps. We are very involved in follow what it's about the subject. So thank you, and thank you to have time to listen to us. Thank you.
Brilliant, Elena. Thank you. So thank you to all of you. Apologies for the slight extra few minutes that we took, but that's also because we got some great comments and questions from the audience. So keep them coming, and come back at 4 p.m. for our next panel, where we will be discussing digitalization in the agri-food supply chain. Okay, so see you very soon.